Okay, this lesson for the Koine Project Class is a challenge. Koine's Calvinist, possessive Calvinist challenge. Anyway, sorry about this, but Calvinist challenge. And this is, speaking of myself, from one constantly categorized Calvinist. Seems like all I had to do is quote Ephesians 2 and 8 to anyone. And so major, let's say major traditions, religious traditions in the community where I pastor, when I severed ties with them and went into the covenant community where I am now pastoring and have been for 22 years and on staff 5 before that. And anyway, long story short is, as long ago as 1987, when I severed my ties, I was categorized Calvinist by, let's say, Church of Christ, categorized Calvinist by Free Will Baptist, Benjamin Randallites, and then the Assemblies of God doctrinal statement, other types of Pentecost, apostolics, whatever they all were, whatever the main lines were, I was then categorized Calvinist. And so really was interested in learning what that was, but I couldn't do that. Began studying and learning and being around people that really might use the word Calvinistic, I suppose, but they never really identified. I learned then in history how Calvin, the man, had quite an opposition and a ill disposition toward Anabaptist and Baptist people, you might say. So never really found out what it was about. But this part here, the challenge is, can any Calvinist in the world find a causal expression of gennāo, that's fathered, that precedes pisteuo, the finite verb? Because you all have heard enough in this class that axiom faith, or regeneration precedes faith. And you remember that when we looked into it, we were asking, is that a finite verb or is that a noun? And then, so we talked about it. And then, of course, we expanded it, elucidated it to say, are we asking, does regeneration occur prior to someone to believe, the simple form of action, prior to someone's act to believe the gospel? Well, that then changed the narrative completely, because we're fathered through the gospel, we're called by the gospel, we're called by the gospel, fathered through the gospel, saved by the gospel, merged by the gospel, our fellowships into the gospel. It seems that the gospel seems to be that context, if we will, that verbal environment apart from which the reality of regeneration is non-existent in the Bible. So when we looked at it, so we went to Galatians 2:16. You remember adotes, that perfect active participle, that is, as ones who, having noticed and are always noticing that no kind of man is justified out from any kind of works of any kind of law except through faithfulness of Jesus Christ. Then he says, comes on down and says, even we ourselves believe. This is that aorist. Do you remember? This is your verb. Remember Simon, sate se, you know that. And so there's the verb, aorist active indicative. So that's simple action. Simple. So we see this causal function of this participle, and it's from ado. Notice that it's an insight word. It's a sight word. So that's from ado. But again, do we have a word? Do we have this? So we don't have this causal. So here's where we would really want to define gennāo adverbially, for example, functioning causally as that causal participle to this finite verb. And then, of course, John 20:31, that we've just looked at that so many times. This was aorist, active subjunctive. There it is. That's simple action, also aorist, active. And there you see your verb, pistou. So in order that you might deliberately believe. Simple action. Causally, we know man's cause. And then here's the participle, that present active participle. So there were two purposes: in order that you might come to believe, or might deliberately causally believe, puncture action. And then it said, and also, or also, in order that ones who are already believing might have life through his name. So that was quite an observation. But again, we still haven't found gennao prior to the finite verb. And that was really an interesting thing, because we noticed that there are a lot of presentations, especially by the unsurpassed scholar Dr. James R. White, where he uses 1 John 5:1, and that's the one where we noticed 1 John 5:1, and this is that. It's to own. There we go. The one who is believing, that is already believing. This is a continuous. So the one who is always, that's that continuous, and already believing. There's ing there. Notice that. Now that says that we had that perfect. You remember reduplicated stem, gag, and nay, tie. Has been previously, prior to this being this one who's already. Again, though, this is present active participle. Of course, function is a gerundive noun, verbal substantive. And yet we have still, this is as close as we come. This is the one Dr. James R. White. Dr. James R. White of Alpha and Omega Ministries. He's written probably the best works on the Trinity, and probably the most substantial works that you'll find. Also, his best-selling book about the King James only controversy, that is his best-selling book. And of course, our history with the King James Bible is now, because of the stewardship by those who identify themselves Baptist, they gave so much feedback to Cambridge University in 1850 that a new and improved, it was refined. That's the good word for that. And it was, the format was properly, as we would say, formed and presented by 1873. And you can go to logos.com and notice their online version of the Bible is F.H.R. Scrivener's 1873, which was catalyzed by Baptists. So it's really, for Baptists, it's our Bible, our English Bible. We wanted it in the best form possible, since it was out there, and since it had become the standard of English Bibles at that time. It's our last Bible of history. It's the last book in which all the controversies of the history of Baptist translation controversies and things like that, all associated with that. So, again, back to the challenge, not to miss the point here. I can certainly do that easily. But 1 John 5:1 said, everyone, it's pos was over here, but I'm not trying to translate that text, but one who is always already believing, ing, continuous, and this was the perfect, active, indicative. This is a finite verb, perfect, has been previously, prior to. So we still don't have the that which I would have expected to find would be a causal function of gennao, and then prior to this finite verb we have ado, which that fits very well with things Jesus said about apocalypto, reveal away from, disclose, or as we would describe it, the consequence of the inbreaking of the proclamation, kerison, of the kingdom of God. And when it's preached and heralded faithfully, this information where people can notice and get it, that to stand right before God and to have life life doesn't come from any law, or Jesus would have died in vain, and that's all taken care of in Galatians. That church. So this was the challenge. Anyone in the world now, I will just say this. Firstly, you can quote Dr. James White, but please cite him, because you may have to go to the best to get references. But and Dr. James R. White does not need to reply to this. He certainly has bigger fish to fry. But if you can find a Calvinist, maybe an amateur or an apprentice, or maybe a very zealous, because I don't know if he'll have done more work than we have and the Koine Project Class, because we have, in my case especially, I was stunned because even after I had been in the covenant community in Landmark, for example, in Jacksonville, Arkansas, later I began to be categorized Calvinist by some of them, so I had to stop and call time out. Wait a minute. I said the Churches of Christ, their denomination, accuse me, categorize me. The Assemblies of God denomination, and people who really don't know the text, they just tout a few of the highlights of their religion, accuse me. Free Will Benjamin Randallites accuse me, and Apostolic, all that, whatever, all the other Pentecost types, even some of the Methodists did. And so here I was, and now I said, so when did you all start doing it? Because I was quite curious, because it was almost, well, I had to be careful because I didn't know if they were, I was in the middle of a prank session. Someone was pranking me because, I have the book, L.D. Foreman, The Church That Jesus Built, have the book by Dr. J.R. Graves. And if you know anything about Dr. John MacArthur, if you go to his early years, if you listen to some of his teachings, he was, if you were familiar with Dr. J.R. Graves' work in the South, you would think Dr. John MacArthur was just taking his cues straight out of Dr. J.R. Graves' work. So I'm not sure how it turned to where the last group, the group I had exited out and entered into, that is, entered into Christ, that is the ecclesia, had begun to categorize. So I had to start this project and say, well, let's then look and see. And so we define, document, disclose fallible elements in the fallible construct Calvinism. So whatever the feature is that regeneration precedes faith, it's obviously unnecessary, or it would be in the text. And if 1 John 5:1 is close you get, which it's still close, I'm not, I wouldn't fault that. And then, of course, I'll end here, but in Philippians, this might help some of you, but it said, it used the charizomai. Remember the text that to us it has been given not only to believe, to keep on believing, it was believing. And I think we need to consider that one, but that shows charizomai, not gennao. So again, I'm not certain how important it is, but if a Calvinist someone identifies themselves, but if you're a scholastic, lexicographer, you use syntax, grammar, hermeneutics, you maybe practice some form of apologetics. If you can, this is our challenge, because this class certainly has worked, and colleagues with whom I labor and collaborate have certainly found it intriguing that as much as this is emphasized, it would really be nice, because when you get to Galatians 2:16, you expect some causal relation here with gennao, but it wasn't there. And then, of course, when you come here, well, like in Philippians, grace to keep on believing, well, that would have been a good place. You'd expected it there. It wasn't there. It was this and not gennao. So maybe it's just something that was touted so long that through a process of accretion, we don't know. But let's stop here. This is our challenge. So have a blessed day. Take the challenge as seriously as you'd like, or move on. But here's the information, and it's a challenge to Calvinist, whatever kind you think you are, because apparently you can just say you're Calvinist and then appropriate all the body of work that's developed over the years, and then just begin to point to that. So we've enjoyed using the Bible languages and lead out from there and have determinants extracted from the languages. So have a blessed day.